The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Eminent historian Dan Rodgers says it's the job of Democrats to obstruct most of the Trump agenda and create a new coalition. Political science professor Allan Lichtman, who predicted the election outcome, warns that Trump is sounding alarms about the advent of fascism. And Bill Press reviews Obama's legacy within the Democratic Party with Politico's Gabriel Debenedetti. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Princeton history professor emeritus Dan Rodgers says the Republican political agenda is a simple-minded fairy tale and that it is the job of Democrats to obstruct their agenda. And we say hello to Dan Rodgers, a history professor emeritus at Princeton University, also author of the book Age of Fracture, which is a history of ideas and culture in our times, and the author of a recent article asking, what next for liberalism? Dan Rodgers, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
You're welcome, Jim. Glad to be here.
And nice to have you with us as well. You suggest that the job of Democrats in Congress is to obstruct the worst of what Republicans offer, but also try to fashion a central coalition on other issues. Is that really possible?
It's very, very hard to know. It's at the moment the Republican Party establishment is putting up a brave front, as if the Paul Ryan agenda, the essentially Tea Party agenda that came into burst sort of into the party and took control of it right after the financial crash. They're behaving as if this was the Republican Party platform, without any cracks, without any dissent, without any possibility of movement. But Donald Trump doesn't believe in that platform, whatever he actually believes in, which is kind of hard to figure out. He's simply not a market fundamentalist in the way that the Paul Ryans of the Republican Party are. And how this is going to play out, we don't know. Whether it plays out on a stimulus bill and what the terms of that stimulus bill might be, we don't know. Whether it plays out in some kind of a confrontation over things like abortion rights, where Donald Trump is talked out of both sides of his mouth, whether it plays out under issues of family policy that his daughter has championed, we don't know. But there are real openings, I think, for Democrats, at the simplest term, to make life difficult for the Republican Party, and maybe more ambitiously, to get some things done that they could not do if they had proposed them themselves. That may be pie in the sky, Jim. That's a hope. But I think that if the Democrats simply say no to everything, the Republicans will say yes to everything they want, and that will be the end of that.
Well, it's interesting because I wonder if, I guess you're not strong enough, though, in order you can't give them a taste of their own medicine since they're in control of House, Senate, and the White House. So is that why you can't do that? Or, are there other things they might be able to do?
Well, certainly they need to mobilize public opinion. They need to mobilize huge numbers of folks flocking to Washington. They need to organize big business, which is not going to be very happy with many of Donald Trump's aspects of his presidency. They need to mobilize not only the New York Times and other folks whom Donald Trump's already demonized, but other parts of the media establishment. There are many, many ways in which civic society can bring its influence to bear. But they're not direct, and they're not easy, and they're not at all like having one of the houses of Congress where you can just say no.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe this is pie in the sky too, Dan. But most Americans soundly rejected Trump at the polls. Could that mean that congressional Republicans might be more amenable to compromise with Democrats?
Oh, I wish, Jim. This particular set of Republicans is more ideologically rigid than any I've seen in my lifetime. How that happened, we know why it happened. It happens because of the ways in which Republican primaries are now organized, the ways in which the most ideologically committed of the voters come out, the ways in which moderate Republicans are as much an endangered species as anything else around. So they're more immune to public pressure than probably any group of politicians before them in a long, long time. I don't think that's true of Trump. Trump is exceedingly sensitive to criticism. He gets angry, he gets defensive. He's quite unpredictable in these sorts of issues. But he might be more open to a sense that Americans were behind him, and therefore shifting so he can be out in front of large numbers of Americans than the congressional Republicans might be.
Now, no matter what advice Democrats hear, do you think it even possible for them to act with that seemingly rock-solid unity that Republicans always seem to show? Or, what about the Sanders-Warren wing of the party?
Well, I sure hope the Democrats don't act with the same rock-solid lockstep that the Republicans do now. I think debate is good for a party. I think debate is the lifeblood of a party, and that it needs to keep on moving forward. The Republican agenda is very, very simple. It's simple-minded. Markets can solve everything. Get government out of the way, and all will be well. It's a fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale that can be conveyed very, very simply. It can be applied to almost any circumstance, any domestic circumstance you want, and you know whether you voted for or against it. The Democratic story is more complicated, more difficult to explain, and it's got more loose play in it, which is that we need to make a juster society. We need to make a more equal society. We need to make a society where people are decent to each other, both at the personal level and the institutional level, and where people work hard, find dignity in life, get heard in the system. This doesn't condense quite so quickly, and it's open for much more debate about the means to those ends. So my hope would be that the Democrats don't tear themselves apart, but keep on talking, pushing at each other, and when push comes to shove, uniting enough to keep that agenda going.
We're speaking with Dan Rodgers, history professor emeritus at Princeton University, author of the book Age of Fracture, also author of a recent article asking what next for liberalism. Dan, should liberals perhaps stop talking about women's rights, gay rights, Black Lives Matter, other buzzwords deemed politically correct and alien to working class whites?
It's another one of those either-ors, and I hope the Democrats do not find themselves impaled on one of these either-or questions. They've got to talk about Black Lives Matter. They've got to talk about rights of gay persons to be full persons in our society. They've got to talk about the race. They've got to talk about gender inequality. And they have to talk about the kinds of grievances that many of the Trump supporters tried to bring into the air this last time. They got to talk about white men who feel stuck in jobs that are going nowhere, or stuck in jobs that are going to disappear. They got to talk about wages. They got to talk about trade. They have to. The tricky part is that for some of Trump voters, this is Arlie Hochschild's conclusion in a wonderful book she wrote, that all persons ought to really pay attention to if they care about Trump voters. They feel that the country was once theirs and now it's no longer theirs. Well, that's a harder thing to speak to for Democrats. But what they have to say, in counter to that, I think, is that this country belongs to all of Americans, and they all need to be heard. And it's not about whether it's this white guy who used to work for GM in Flint, or whether it's a black woman in Detroit. The Democratic Party has to be accountable to all of them.
Gay rights and same-sex marriage seemingly have become acceptable in America, and suddenly, if you will, kind of quickly all of a sudden after talking about it for many years. But at the same time, didn't that scare a lot of straight voters into actually aligning with Trump?
Yes, it certainly did. And here's where one of the potential progressive forces in American society has just been stymied, and it's tragic, but it's probably not going to go away. And that's church voters, or voters for whom the kinds of questions that they talk about in their faith communities become really salient questions. Because the churches, which might be voices for the poor, and many are, but not enough of them are. They might be voices for justice. They might be voices for better, safer neighborhoods. Might be voices for gun control. They might be voices for more effective ways to think about the drug epidemic in the United States. There's a lot of goodwill and a lot of potential social conscience in the faith communities. But they become mesmerized by what they think of as the assault on the traditional family. And and for too many of the only issues that matter are abortion and gay rights. Again, this may be pie in the sky, but those Democrats who are still attached to faith communities need, I hope, find ways to be in deeper and stronger and more searching dialogue with those in faith communities which think of themselves as on the other side of an enormous culture war. Because until the goodwill of that group of Americans gets organized, we're at a kind of deadlock.
And, it's interesting because hasn't Trump actually shown a little bit of being a progressive on some social issues over the years?
Yes, he's much closer to the Democrats on these. What Donald Trump is going to do how he's going to manage the tension between the zillions of things he said, the things he actually believes, and the things he knows he needs to say in order to keep the Republican Party with him. How he's going to manage those tensions, I don't know. But if the Democrats are smart, they won't write off the Donald Trump who is a liberal on these kinds of social issues. They'll try to bring that out. They'll try to find ways to enlist those in ways that will at least maintain the rights of gay Americans and maybe even expand them.
Now, since the Republican Party is no longer what it once was, is it time for something to replace the Democratic Party as we knew it? Perhaps a set of new, younger, charismatic leaders?
Well, if the Democratic Party can't continuously, year in and year out, find new charismatic leaders, then it's dead. Every party's dead unless it can revitalize itself in this way. And so, more power to the forces inside the Democratic Party that help make that happen. But my dream is that the Republican Party splits because its fault lines are so deeply etched and the whole thing is as precarious as it is, and the Democratic Party holds together, finding ways to expand its agenda, finding ways. As I said in the piece that you mentioned at the beginning of this broadcast, Democrats have to find a way to tell a story, not to change their story, but to tell the story they already have, in a way that's powerful, simple, communicable, and that grabs people. That's if there's going to be a new leadership on the part of the Democrats, I think it's going to come from people who are able to do that. The way that Barack Obama, in a way, was able to try to articulate a new, hopeful story. Okay. And unfortunately, the way that Donald Trump was able to say, I've got a whole new game plan. Don't ask me too carefully what it is, but I'm going to change everything. Trust me, we're going to make it better. Democrats have to find a story that in much better ways, much less malignant ways, catches people at their hearts and makes them feel that something important is going to happen.
It scares me, Dan, that one of probably the most powerful things that Trump said throughout his campaign was right there at the end when he said, "What else have you got to lose?" And people bit.
I don't, again, my hopeful side, I don't think people think America is in as bad shape as Trump claimed it was. Some do. But I don't think it's an overall winning strategy. Certainly he can't carry on. He can't come back 4 years from now, or Republicans come back 2 years from now and say, look, the country's still in a terrible, terrible shape. Trust us. But the surprise of this election was that a completely negative campaign was able to appeal to as many voters as it did.
Yeah. Okay. Dan Rodgers, history professor emeritus at Princeton University, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. You can check out his book, Age of Fracture, which is a history of ideas and culture in our times. Dan, thank you so much for your time with us today. We do appreciate it as always and look forward to having you back again soon.
You're very welcome.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and...
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Allan Lichtman, the professor who predicted the election, says the Democrats are tottering and need to take a page from the Republicans and develop a compelling message. We'll talk to him about that in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
By gollies, the Donald delivers. Trump and his new blue ribbon panel of working-class champions have announced a bold initiative to create millions of American jobs. A spokesman for the panel, Steve Schwarzman, praised Trump as a leader who wants to, quote, do things a lot better in our country for all Americans. Wait a minute, Steve Schwarzman? Isn't he a billionaire hedge fund huckster on Wall Street? Yes, and holy money bags, there's Jamie Dimon, head of scandal-ridden J.P. Morgan Chase. Working-class champions? Trump's whole jobs panel is made up of Wall Street banksters and corporate powers like Walmart that are notorious for laying off and ripping off workers. Trump, the candidate, fulminated against such moneyed elites, calling them, quote, responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class. But now, in a spectacular flip-flop, he's brought these robbers directly inside his presidency, asking them to be architects of his economic strategy. Worse, he's doing this in the name of helping workers. Hello, to develop policies beneficial to working stiffs, bring in some working stiffs. But not a single labor advocate is on his policy council, in his cabinet, or anywhere near his White House. Thus, the so-called job creation plan announced by Trump and his corporate cohorts doesn't create any jobs, but calls instead for, ta-da, deregulating Wall Street. These flim-flammers actually want us rubes to believe that freeing banksters to return to casino-style speculation and consumer scams will give them more money that they can invest in American jobs. This is Jim Hightower saying, do they think we have sucker wrappers around our heads? Trump's scheme will let banks make a killing, but does not require them to invest in jobs, so they won't. There's a name for this, fraud.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor. All for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Political scientist Allan Lichtman says he won't call it fascism, but early signs from Trump are sounding alarms as to what to expect. And we say hello to Allan Lichtman, a distinguished professor of history at American University and a prolific author and commentator on presidential politics. Dr. Lichtman correctly predicted Donald Trump's victory. Allan Lichtman, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
My pleasure.
And our pleasure to have you with us. And I guess, first of all, congratulations. You were one of the few and certainly the most prominent of academics to predict the Trump victory. What was your formula?
Well, our formula was actually a very simple one. And the key is forget the polls, ignore the pundits, don't look at the day-to-day events of the campaign. My system is based on the thesis that presidential elections are judgments on the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. I developed it by looking at every American presidential election from 1860 to 1980 in collaboration with the renowned mathematician, Beludja Kailas-Borak. And I have 13 key factors that gauge the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. And just to mention a few, the formula revealed many vulnerabilities of the White House party, the Democrats. They took a pasting in the midterms of 2014. They had a contentious nomination struggle. They had pesky third parties out against them. They were not having a sitting president running. Open seats are tough to defend. The keys go term by term. The second Obama term didn't feature a major domestic policy accomplishment like the Affordable Care Act. It didn't feature a big splashy foreign policy success like the dispatching of bin Laden in the first term. So these are the vulnerabilities that were evident that had nothing to do with the day-to-day events of the campaign or the polling.
As a presidential historian, do you think Trump will succeed?
Well, again, it all depends on your values. You know, you're a Democratic group, and I think according to your values, Trump succeeding by his own lights would be a defeat from your perspective for the country. For example, Trump just appointed the Attorney General of Oklahoma to head the EPA, and he is a crusader against the EPA, against environmental regulations, and has been a very powerful supporter of the fossil fuel industry. So if Trump succeeds in undermining or even destroying the EPA and rolling back progress on climate change, that may be a success in his own mind, but obviously not to those who care about dealing with climate change that may well be the most serious threat to our survival and well-being on this planet.
In terms of the political parties and the right and left wings of the body politics, is the old order dead now?
The old order is certainly tottering, but not for the Republicans. And the pundits had it 180 degrees wrong, as they usually do, saying, oh my God, Trump has fractured the Republican Party. What is the future of the Republican Party? What they failed to realize is this election, and I wrote a piece on this, posed far more danger to the Democratic Party, and that has come to pass. The Democratic Party now is a shadow party. The Republicans have the presidency, the House, the Senate. They're going to have the Supreme Court soon. They have the great majority of governorships and state legislatures. They're likely to be in charge of the redistricting and gerrymander the districts again after the census of 2020. And, Trump as an individual is outside of the mold of the classic politician. So far, looking at his cabinet appointments, his priorities are right in line with the priorities of certainly the right wing of the Republican Party, which today is the majority of the Republican Party. And it's the Democrats who are tottering, who are going to have to reorganize, develop a better message, organize better at the grassroots.
We're speaking with Allan Lichtman, Distinguished Professor of History at American University, of course, prolific author, commentator on presidential politics, and one of the few to correctly predict Donald Trump's victory. If you look at the definition and historical examples of fascism, does Trump qualify?
Yeah, I don't want to tarnish the meaning of fascism by calling Trump a fascist. But let me say this. There are warning signs. Let me point to just a few of them. A hallmark of fascism is the cult of personality. You obviously saw that with a leader like Mussolini in Italy, and certainly Trump falls squarely within that rubric. Everything about his campaign and his politics centers on Donald Trump. Another hallmark is the attack on the free press, and Donald Trump has been far more active than any candidate in history in attacking and threatening the survival of the free press in America. Another hallmark of fascism is utter disregard for the truth, to simply massage the truth, break the truth for their own purposes. And Trump, far more than any candidate in history, has broken the truth and simply told a whole series of lies, many of them totally transparent. Like, I saw hundreds of Muslims in New Jersey celebrating 9/11, or I was against the Iraq war before it started, when he's on record as saying he's for it. Or I got a letter from the NFL objecting to the debates. He got no letter. Or like 2 or 3 million illegal immigrants voted in the election of 2016. All absolute demonstrable lies, but it really doesn't matter to Donald Trump. And of course, there's always this undertone of violence, of attacking your opponents, of not being able to bear criticism. And that was a hallmark of the Trump campaign, and it's continued. Certainly, I'm not going to call Trump a fascist, but I would call America's attention to some of these alarm bells that are ringing.
It scares me equally that so many people believe so many of those lies that were obviously blatant lies. That's another
Absolutely.
problem.
It's really a huge problem, and I partly fault the press for this. For a very long time, the press was not very vigilant in exposing the lies of Donald Trump. They eventually came around to this. But rather than all this meaningless drivel that the press goes out in the hundreds of millions of words about the polls and the horse race, one of the signal things the press should be doing, and much more so, is investigative reporting and being the gatekeeper of the truth. It's very important that the press mediate what has become a fundamental clash between fact and fiction in our politics.
Mm-hmm. How should Democrats and progressives prepare for the 2018 midterm and 2020 general elections?
Well, I think just from a hard politics point of view, I'm just going to put it that way, the Democrats should take a page from the Republicans. They should not go along with what Donald Trump wants to do. They should not, we're going to work with him. No, because 90% of what Donald Trump wants to do is antithetical to what Democrats and progressives believe in. Some of it, truly virulent, like on climate change. And politically, if you give Donald Trump what he wants, you're going to have 8 years, not 4 years of Donald Trump. And of course, the Democrats and progressives must develop a compelling message and must rebuild the grassroots organization of the party.
On a personal note, before we let you go, you ran in a Democratic primary for Senate. That didn't work out so well. Why did you do it? What lessons, if any, did you learn?
Yeah. I did it because I thought, and this is kind of ironic in light of Donald Trump, but I thought, the American people were ready for someone who was qualified for office, but not in the typical way. I think, my years of studying politics, my years of, I think is public service to teaching thousands of students, working on scores of civil rights cases, qualified me for the Senate. And my argument was, you hate the Senate. The Congress has lower approval ratings than Attila the Hun, but you keep sending the same kind of people. Why are you doing that? You know, I had a commercial that kind of went viral called The Big Splash, in which I actually jumped into a canal, made a big splash, and I said, you know, you can send a conventional politician to Washington, and it won't make a ripple, or you can make a big splash by doing something different. I also had a lot of issue ideas. You know, I wanted to end the war in Iraq. I wanted to, this was a decade ago, dedicate ourselves to getting off fossil fuels and making the transition to clean and renewable energies. But I have to tell you, I'm a much better professor and analyst than I was a political candidate. I was a terrible political candidate. Nobody listened to what I had to say, and it was a pretty crashing defeat. But the couple of lessons are, one, it's really hard, you know, to crack through as, you know, a professor or someone with my kind of qualification. We don't have anyone like me in the United States Senate. And it takes so much money to run for office. Maryland is a little tiny state, and it took $10 million to win the senatorial election in Maryland.
Well, I could certainly understand why you wouldn't do it again.
Yeah, once you got $10 million for me, I'm not doing it.
Right. Fair enough. Allan Lichtman, Distinguished Professor of History at American University, joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Doctor, as always, we appreciate your time and look forward to having you back again soon.
You know where to find me, my friend.
Thank you very much. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Politico's Gabriel Debenedetti about the future of the Democratic Party.
Gabriel Debenedetti here, national political reporter for Politico. You've been taking a look at a lot of the Democratic side of the ledger. Meanwhile, what's our former president been up to? Barack Obama on the sidelines?
Yeah, he's totally on the sidelines right now. He is kite surfing with Richard Branson on his private island, which sounds not so bad.
Yeah.
I think most people don't blame him for that. But what I've found is that, you know, especially in the race for DNC chair, but also in some of the broader debates that are going on in the future of the Democratic Party, you know, how to rebuild, there's started to be a pretty ugly debate, or at least a pretty painful one, about his political legacy. Because obviously he's the only person who has had a national machine that has won twice in the last 20-something years. But at the same time, a lot of Democrats are saying, well, listen, under your stewardship of the party, we lost thousands of seats in state legislatures, lost 10 governorships, lost the Senate and the House. You know, so why should we trust you to have some sort of role? Because now what he's been saying, and this was before he went on vacation, is, you know, I want to have a role in helping to rebuild the party. That's not exactly an uncontroversial thing for him to be saying right now.
Well, as you point out, though, it's kind of too little too late, maybe, or a little late to the feast for him to talk about rebuilding the Democratic Party, because in all honesty, he didn't give that almost any attention at all during his 8 years.
You know, I have talked over the last 2 days with a lot of Democrats who are sort of involved in the rebuilding stuff right now, and what they say is, listen, this is a guy who, when he was the leader of the party as the president, you know, didn't care enough about the DNC to replace Debbie Wasserman Schultz once it was clear that her tenure was a problem. He didn't want to play in the 2010 governor's races, and that was right before the redistricting happened. That was essentially a disaster for Democrats. You know, he in some ways scorned the process of political, you know, building a political infrastructure, because he had his own, and his own worked for him. It just didn't work down the ballot very well.
Right. So he had his own Organizing for America, which became kind of a force for the Obama agenda.
Correct.
Not for helping Democrats around the country.
And it was a very big controversy within the DNC, though, again, this was not something that really burst out into the open much, because base voters love Barack Obama, and they continue to. But the reality is OFA, which was his campaign, then turned into his advocacy group, didn't hand over the data and email list from his campaign to the DNC until 2015, so well after Obama was no longer running for anything. And that was a big point of tension within party operatives, because they basically said, listen, thank you for winning the presidency twice. We love you very much. But, how do we use your engine of victory for ourselves? And it was a big question.
What is happening, if anything, with this movement that he expressed an interest in doing with Eric Holder? Is there an organization? Is there money?
Yeah.
Are they doing anything? Is it just too early?
It's very early. I mean, a lot of Democrats have talked about starting groups like this, but Holder's group with which Obama has blessed seems to be the one that is furthest down the line. It's called the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, I believe. And it seems like what they're doing right now is trying to raise money, but what they'll be doing is trying to influence state legislature races. And there are some in North Carolina this year, and they'll also be trying to play in the Virginia governor's race this year, because the Virginia governor has a say over redistricting in that state. So what they're going to be trying to do, is playing in these very, very, very local races, which obviously is not something that you are used to seeing a former president do.
Okay. But so Holder is clearly the Obama operation, right?
That's correct.
Is there any alternative force, and who's leading it? And
there's a group called the State Innovation Exchange, which is trying to do this in a more progressive way, but it's unclear how these two groups are going to work together. Broadly speaking, the people running for DNC chair talk about wanting to do this, and of course Bernie Sanders is Our Revolution, the group born of his campaign, has talked about doing this kind of thing. But it's not as if there are a bunch of efforts out there that are trying to do this in a concerted way. Right now everyone is trying to figure out what their role really is in this new Donald Trump reality, because some groups want to be the resistance, some groups want to start the rebuilding. Everyone's trying to figure out what their lane is going to be.
Is it, in effect, a replay of the Democratic primary, the Bernie people versus the Hillary people?
There's some of that. I mean, and I've written a bit about how folks are desperate to pretend that is not a tension, but it absolutely is a tension among voters in particular, because they feel like a lot of the issues of the primary were not properly discussed, and that's why you see a lot of the folks who are running for DNC chair go out of their way to try and talk about these issues, to try and say, I'm Keith Ellison, but I supported Hillary Clinton, or I'm Tom Perez, but I'm a good progressive, that kind of thing. But there's also now, in addition to the Hillary versus Bernie stuff, there's also the Democrat versus Barack Obama stuff. So there are a lot of tensions really brewing in the party as it tries to pull itself together. And the question is whether antipathy towards Trump is going to be enough to pull them all together before they fall apart.
Right. No, I sense that as well, and I've raised that issue, and everybody I have, they say, no, we're all together now, but that's BS.
I don't know.
There's still some lasting unhappiness, right, particularly toward the DNC, because the Bernie people, and I'm a Bernie person, right, really feel that the DNC, right, they were in Hillary's camp. They were doing everything they could to screw Bernie, and the emails that came out confirmed that.
Right. And I think one thing that has not happened right now is, the DNC has not really gone on a charm offensive, so to speak, or no DNC surrogates have tried to reach out in a full way to the Bernie folks. I think what they're doing is waiting for a new chair, for a new administration, to basically try and bring those people back into the fold, because it's a big problem for them institutionally if such a huge, energized portion of the party doesn't trust them.
I also think that we are 20 days into the Trump administration, correct, right? So I'm not totally surprised that they don't have their act together. But also, if there is something to be learned from the Republicans, right? You look at what the Tea Party did, and the Tea Party was able to exist inside of the Republican Party while also beating back against the Republican Party. Yeah. And I think that you're going to have you will have a rift, right, in the Democratic Party. You will continue to have that. I don't think the Democrats, sort of by definition, will ever be on the same page.
Sure.
So, I think that there's going to be a sort of a period of maybe a little chaos here. And there's going to be sort of the left wing's Tea Party that emerges out of this.
Totally, but I think one thing that people are also very quick to worry about right now, which is not necessarily a reason for worry in reality, is that people are going to disagree with each other within the party. But when you are the party of, when you are the minority party or the party of resistance, as Democrats learned in 2006, you don't need to have one message, one leader that pulls everyone together. It's very easy for them to make electoral, well, maybe not easy. It should be a simpler proposition for them to make electoral gains simply by not being the Donald Trump party right now.
Yeah.
And that may not be something that they want to admit at this point, but the idea of them having major problems is going to be a huge fault line and a huge problem for the party's existence moving forward. May not be the case.
Right. I want to go back to this challenge for DNC chair because it's clear now at the briefings. I remember asking Josh Earnest whether or not the president had a candidate, right? And Josh went out of his way to say, no, the president's not going to endorse. He likes them all. Whatever. And then he went on to praise Tom Perez without mentioning Keith Ellison.
Right.
At President Obama's last news conference, he was asked, it was either the next last or the next to last, anyhow, he was asked the same question by someone. And again, he said, whatever the party does. But then he went on to praise Tom Perez is the greatest labor secretary we've ever had, which would probably be true, I would say. But it was very clear that Tom Perez is his candidate.
Yes, absolutely. And he has been endorsed not by Barack Obama formally,
right?
But by Joe Biden, by Eric Holder, by Tom Vilsack,
right.
A lot of people who were seen as, these longtime Obama loyalists. So there's no question about it. And he's really gone out of his way, partially because of the issue that we were just talking about, where folks do not like what Obama did with the party itself, to not be seen as the Obama guy. He's spent most of his time, frankly, trying to convince Bernie Sanders supporters that he's not some Hillary Obama establishment Democrat, and it is true that he's a fairly progressive guy.
He's got a great progressive record, but he's definitely the Obama.
He is more or less the pick of the establishment, which is something that he's trying very hard to work against. That perception, in the same way that Keith Ellison has had to go out of his way to say, "I'm not the Bernie Sanders candidate in this race."
Now, then you got Keith, who is endorsed by Bernie, and Larry Cohen and Our Revolution. And Mark Pocan, a lot of members of the Progressive Caucus. But at the same time, he went out and he got Chuck Schumer's endorsement.
Totally.
And Harry Reid's endorsement.
That's right.
Right.
So he's clearly making the case. I mean, his buzzword whenever he talks to DNC members and whenever he's at one of these forums is unity, because clearly his pitch is, listen, we had a last year that was pretty tough, but let's try and bring us all together here. And he, to his credit, was extremely good during the campaign at going out of his way to make sure, once Bernie was no longer in the race, that he was a prominent Clinton surrogate and that he worked to bring Bernie delegates into the fold, which was something that, not many other Bernie turned Hillary surrogates worked on.
Right. And then you've got this outlier among all the candidates. The one that we find most interesting is Pete Buttigieg.
Yeah.
From mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who endorsed this week by Martin O'Malley.
That's right.
So this is the new generation of leadership here, right?
That is explicitly the pitch. So Pete Buttigieg is this 35-year-old mayor of South Bend, Indiana, who's saying, I'm not a Bernie guy, I'm not a Hillary guy, I'm a young guy, basically. And there's been a lot of writing about how people like him are the face of the future of the party.
Yeah, from the Midwest, executive experience.
Absolutely, and that's what Martin O'Malley said.
Yeah.
So O'Malley, when I spoke with him, basically said, listen, this is the guy who can move the party forward. He's not trying to say that Pete Buttigieg is the Martin O'Malley of this race, because
I don't think he wants that comparison.
Correct. Yes, correct. But basically the pitch is, and this is something that all of the candidates who are not Ellison or Perez say, but Buttigieg has been most forceful in saying, I'm not the Hillary guy, I'm not the Bernie guy, let's just move past that. I represent the future. We need a young, new face of the party. And again, the other folks are saying that as well. Jamie Harrison from South Carolina, Ray Buckley from New Hampshire. But Buttigieg is obviously the one who's gotten the most attention to it.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Dan Rodgers, Allan Lichtman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.